When Paul and Barnabas had finished their work at Antioch near Pisidia, they had a good reception, but a preacher is likely to have a good reception in one place and not in another. And so after he and Barnabas, and he was the chief spokesman by this time, after he and Barnabas had finished their work in the synagogue at Antioch near Pisidia, there was a great division in the people who lived there. Some sided with Paul and Barnabas and believed in Jesus, and others of them did not. Others of them thought that Paul and Barnabas were only there to stir up trouble in the Jewish community. And so there was a great division in the people, and after staying there a week or so, Paul and Barnabas left. They left, no doubt, because they would have been gathered together, put in jail or something like that. And so they went to a town that was nearby called Iconium. They found a synagogue there, and they went in and preached there. But they didn't have nearly the success. Apparently they didn't, at least. They didn't have nearly the success at Iconium that they had at Antioch. And so after a while they decided to leave there and to travel south. They had traveled eastward from Antioch near Pisidia. There were still, all of this was in the Roman province of Galatia. And so they thought that they would travel south down from the city of Iconium toward Lystra. And there is a little bit told about Paul, the work of Paul and Barnabas at Lystra. They go on from there to Derbe, but hardly anything is said about their work at Derbe. But there is more that is said of Lystra. When they got to Lystra, they would have gone into the synagogue, I'm sure, if there had been a synagogue, but there apparently was no synagogue. Only Gentiles lived in Lystra. It was Lystra and Derbe are called cities of Lithuania, and so they had their own language. They lived in the Roman province of Galatia, but they were a sort of a unique group, Derbe and Lystra, both of the Lycaonian dialect of language. And so Paul and Barnabas went into the city. They tried to preach some, but were not very successful. There was no synagogue. There was nobody who knew anything about the God of Israel. But while they were there, some Jews from Iconium came down to try to stir things up, to try to save any Jewish population that might have been in Lystra. And so some of the Jews of Antioch near Pisidia came along with the Jews of Iconium, and they tried to stir things up. Paul saw a man among the people that were in Lystra. He saw a man who was lame, had been lame from his mother's womb. And so Paul spoke to the man. The Bible says when Paul saw that he had faith to be healed. I'm not sure what that means. Sometimes the Bible speaks about faith as being an essential ingredient in a person's being healed, and sometimes it seems to have nothing whatsoever to do with it. For example, in John 9, when there's a blind man who is healed, he apparently doesn't know who Jesus is, and as the story unfolds, that becomes more and more apparent. And so sometimes the healing of a person the faith of the person who is healed seems to have nothing whatsoever to do with it, and in other times it seems to be essential. Well, in this case at least, the Bible says that Paul saw that the man had faith to be healed, and so he healed him. The man jumped on his feet. He was leaping, jumping about. It wasn't partially healed. It wasn't healing that took place over a period of a week or a few days or a few hours. It was an immediate thing. And so the man was made whole. Well, when the people of Lystra first saw Paul and Barnabas and heard them speak, they thought that they must be somebody sent from the gods. And when they saw Paul perform the miracle that he did, they believed that Paul was one of the gods who had come down to visit them, and Barnabas was another one. Now, since Barnabas didn't say as much, Barnabas was associated with Zeus. He was the strong type, silent type. He didn't say much. And Paul, on the other hand, was associated with Hermes, the messenger god of the Greeks. And so Paul spoke to them, and he spoke to them. You see, the reason that the speech that he gives is so important is because we can see here the difference between the way Paul preached when it was a strictly Gentile audience that he faced, and when he faced a Jewish audience like he had faced at Iconium or at Antioch near Pisidium. The Bible says that in verse 5 of chapter 14 of Acts, that when an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat and to stone them, Paul and Barnabas, they became aware of it, Paul and Barnabas became aware of it, and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe. And so it's in Lystra and Derbe that they're working. And it says that at Lystra a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. And the man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze on it and seen that he had faith to be made well, that he healed him. And so they went from thinking that Paul and Barnabas were messengers sent to them from the gods to identifying them with the gods. And so the priest of Zeus went to the temple outside the city, and that was really common in Greek cities for a temple. For example, at Ephesus, it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but the temple to Diana or to Artemis was outside the city walls. I guess the people of the town thought they built the walls, but they thought that a foreign invading army would not dare to destroy the temple. And so the priest of Zeus, which incidentally in the Greek world, there was no professional class of priests. It wasn't like the descendants of Aaron, for example, and the people of Israel. Among the people of many people who lived in the Near East had something of a professional class of priests, but there was none with the Greeks. You were elected to the priesthood, like you were elected to a city position, and you held the office maybe for a year, and so you could be a former priest. But the priest of Zeus took out sacrifices to the temple, and he started to offer them in appreciation to Zeus, who had come to visit them. And of course, as I said, Paul was associated with Hermes, the messenger god, since he did most of the speaking. And he had healed, it had been Paul's word that had healed the man, the lame man. And so they, the people of the city of Lystra were getting ready to offer sacrifices and worship to Paul and Barnabas. Well, Paul and Barnabas had to halt that process. They didn't want to teach them or speak of themselves as God. It says in verse 12, I'm still in the 14th chapter of Acts, that the people of Lystra began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garland to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowd. Now, if you visit a city where there's a lot of archaeological remains from the ancient world, like Ephesus, for example, which isn't too far away from Antioch or Pisidia, if you go into the city of Ephesus, There are marbles all up and down the streets of the city that archaeologists have set up so that we can see the garlands placed around the neck of oxen that would be sacrificed to Artemis or some other god. A white animal was sacrificed to the Olympian gods, and a black animal was sacrificed sometimes to the heroes, like Hercules, for example. And so the priest of Zeus went outside the city, and he was ready to offer sacrifices to Paul that he associated with Zeus, or Paul that he associated with Hermes, and with Barnabas that he associated with Zeus. But Paul and Barnabas tried to stop them in the process. The Bible says that, verse 14, I'm still in the 14th chapter, that when the apostles, notice Barnabas and Paul are both called apostles, and when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, that they were going to offer sacrifice, they tore their robes and rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, the gospel of Jesus Christ, so that you should turn from these things, from worshiping Hermes and Zeus, and turn to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth. In the generations gone by," Paul says, "that he, this one God that we're proclaiming, permitted all nations to go their own ways. And yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even saying these things, with difficulty, Paul and Barnabas kept the people from offering sacrifices to them. Now, there are two places in the book of Acts. You may not know this term, but natural theology, where the world around speaks of God, where natural theology comes into view. One of them is here in Lystra, where there are no Jews that Paul can speak to. But this one God that we're proclaiming, Paul says, has given you rain from the heavens, the fertile soil, all of the things that you need for life. But it's that God that we're proclaiming, not Zeus or Hermes or any of the gods around. Well, about that time, there were Jews who came from Antioch and Iconium that came into Lystra. And when they did, they told the people of Lystra that Paul and Barnabas were just stirring up trouble and that they deserved to be killed. And so they took Paul outside the city, since he was the chief spokesman, and they stoned him. The people of the town stoned him. Now, I can't imagine anybody living through being stoned, but Paul somehow did. Maybe they didn't hit him in the right place, or he fell down and they thought he was dead. But Paul revived after they left him, after the people of Lystra left. Paul revived. Some of the brethren took him back into Lystra and nursed him. Must have been a few weeks. Nursed him so that he came back. He retrieved his health again. And then he and Barnabas went on to Derbe, where they preached. And as I said before, hardly anything is said about Paul's work at Derbe. But Lystra, there is more that is said, particularly Paul's sermon, where there are no Jews, where he wants to establish that the God that he preaches is not only the giver of Jesus Christ, but that he has given us the things of nature. He's given us the world that we live in. And so natural theology comes into play here. Now, there are many critics of natural theology. For example, why does God allow a hurricane or an earthquake or a tsunami to come and to kill many thousands of innocent people? I don't know all of the answers to natural theology. But Paul does speak of God providing for the people of Israel. Now, the other place where natural theology appears in the book of Acts, you probably already know, and when I tell you, it'll come to your mind if it hasn't already. But when Paul is in Athens, he preaches to the philosophers there. There were not Jews, apparently, in the audience, and so Paul deals with natural theology again, and he's talking to the philosophers in Acts 17, to the philosophers who were in Athens. And so there are two times in Acts, once in Lystra, once in Athens, where Paul uses natural theology, you might say, natural offerings that he could give them about the nature of the God who created them and who was sending them. And so Paul and Barnabas preached. They preached all they could to the people of Lystra, and then were taken outside the city, and Paul was stoned and then nursed back to health. But that's essentially the end of the first missionary journey. Now they travel on back toward Antioch of Syria, where they had begun the missionary journey. And in Antioch they found that certain Jews had come up from Jerusalem and had tried to convince the church that Gentiles had to obey the law of Moses in order to be saved. Well, of course, Paul and Barnabas weren't having any of that. And so they go to Jerusalem in the 15th chapter for the Jerusalem conference, as we call it. And then Paul and Silas began the second missionary journey. It's a much longer journey, the second journey is, than the first one was. But at any rate, Paul's preaching in Lystra, I think, is memorable, particularly because it relies on what God has revealed himself in the world around us. And God does speak to us. God tells us something about himself in the world around us, as well as in the gospel of Christ. And so we'll go on into the second missionary journey next week from the book of Acts. We're looking at Paul in the book of Acts.